Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Jiaqing Chen. I'm a professor in global studies, and I'm the acting director of the East Asia Center. Thank you so much for joining us for this inaugural annual event. It's the East Asia Center China Lecture, which is a series that's motivated by concerns about escalating tensions between the United States and China, and is made possible through the generous support of the China Understanding and Peace Fund. Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to also thank Shiba Balagi, the academic coordinator of the Area Global Initiative, our financial analyst, Bashar Turabiye, and our director, Kate McDonald, who's recently been on leave, for all of their work organizing this lecture and the accompanying events, including the graduate student workshop that will take place tomorrow. Introduce Dr. Andrew Bilio. He's an associate professor in the Department of History at Villanova University. Professor Liu is an expert in the history of modern China, South and East Asia, histories and theories of political economy and capitalism. He received his PhD in global and comparative history from Columbia University. Professor Liu has held fellowships and positions from Hong Kong University, the Social Science Research Council, the Luce ACLS, and Fulbright Hays programs, among others. He's a frequent contributor to numerous outlets such as the London Review of Books, N+1, and The Nation. Professor Liu is the author of T-War, A History of Capitalism in China and India, published by Yale University Press in 2020, and the recipient of the 2022 Ralph Gamori Prize by the Business History Conference. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Liu for his lecture, End of an Era, China's Changing Place in the World
Market. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Let me first thank, again, Professor Kate McDonald, Jiaqing Chen, Shiba Balagi, the East Asia Center, the China Understanding and Peace Fund, and for the generous invitation. Thanks to all of you for coming, which during what is, I'm sure, a very busy time during the final week of the quarter, where everyone has many commitments. So I think I should begin by noting that my training or my day job is a historian, thinking about world history from the 18th to the 20th century. So being invited to give a talk about the 21st century has been a really useful exercise. It's also been a learning experience, kind of stretching myself to connect the dots with the 21st century. And hopefully, I think, the way I think about this is not so much me, the expert, telling you what to think, but kind of using this as an opportunity to kind of begin a conversation. And hopefully, many of you will, tell me and tell others, other aspects of this topic that you're much more of an expert in than myself. But let me begin as a common starting point with this premise that I think we can all acknowledge that, everyone in this room is probably aware of the rising animosity between the US and Chinese governments in recent years. Just this spring, we've had incidents such as the United States government shooting down an alleged spy plane or spy balloon over South Carolina, Congress threatening to ban the Chinese app TikTok from the American internet, and saying that sentence makes me feel 70 years old. And the broader list of grievances against China include things such as accusations of cheating in business, resulting in tariffs and embargoes, human rights abuses and military escalation in places like Xinjiang, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, and of course, China's role in the outbreak of the pandemic, whether from the so-called illegal wet markets or a leak from the alleged top-secret bioweapons laboratories in Wuhan, China. Amidst all these swirling controversies, a Pew survey released last September indicated that American attitudes towards China have reached historic lows after a turning point of about 2011. Right? So people had a relatively, maybe slowly better view of China up until 2011, and it's kind of cratered since then. The main concerns, according to the survey, revolve around questions of human rights, military aggression, and espionage. And underlying all of these is a general ominous sense of China's rising power and the belief that China is a threat to domestic national interests. Now, there's similar indicators out there that kind of map onto this chart that I'm showing you here. So for instance, starting around 2012, we've had lawsuits by US companies against Chinese companies that have spiked in the US system, right? So and this kind of reflects the sense of a hostile business environment in China. And here in the university, it's been well documented that there's been sort of a peak around 2011, 2012, 2013 in enrollments in Mandarin language courses that have kind of plateaued and fallen off a little since then. I think I hypothesize reflecting a sort of less of an interest in studying and working in China in the future. And I'll return to these dates below. So how do we make sense of this kind of recent turn, this kind of recent animosity, at least from the United States side? So in my talk, my goal here, my sort of provisional attempt is to suggest the value of situating these recent trends within a longer time frame, right? Doing so would challenge many conventional narratives that are out there from politicians and journalists, and it would also cut against the temptation to view this new US-China rivalry as a sort of clash of civilizational values, and instead to think of it as a rivalry that's been forged amidst profound social interdependence, right, between these two societies. So for instance, many are probably aware that the Biden administration will often describe its policies towards China as a rivalry grounded in a philosophical battle, right, for the future of the world between democracies versus authoritarianism. But there are several historical examples that kind of undercut this and suggest that this is actually driven by deeper dynamics. So for instance, as the sociologist Ho Feng Hung has pointed out, in the late 80s and early 90s, US politicians were well aware of the atrocities carried out by the Chinese government in Tiananmen Square in 1989, but they ultimately put aside these concerns in pursuit of greater trade deals with China. As the first George H.W. Bush, President George Bush wrote to Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping in 1989 in a private letter, but in his autobiography, so it's not a secret. He says, we must not let the aftermath of tragic recent events undermine a vital relationship patiently built up over the past 17 years. But then over the years, trade and business relationships with China began to break down in the 2000s and early 2010s, only then did these concerns, these kind of lingering concerns about human rights and authoritarianism once again take center stage in the United States. Indeed, as pointed out by Jake Warner with the Quincy Institute, the US actually has many alliances with non-democratic states, such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, while opinion towards China actually remains quite high among countries in the global south, including many democracies, right? So this democracy versus authoritarianism binary, it doesn't quite work. That same Pew survey I just mentioned, right, corroborates this point that attitudes towards China remain unpopular in rich European and East Asian countries, but in fact, it is quite popular across Africa and Latin America. Right? So I'll talk more about that kind of split below. Now, I don't say this to be glib about questions of human rights and democracy, which are, of course, important concerns, only to say that historically, these issues have become politicized, at least in the United States, only at specific moments in time. And they almost always seem to emerge within a broader context of the US and China's entanglements in the realm of political economy, where we're talking trade, finance, and especially industry. And so this is going to be kind of the main focus of today's talk, what I've chosen to discuss, which is the recent political economic history of China. Now, these questions are in a lot of ways unavoidable because for all the talk about geopolitics and different cultural values between East and West, right, fundamentally, the modern US-China relationship is basically an economic one, right, with both sides trying to use the other for their own material gain. Now, I know economics sometimes strikes people as intimidating or overly abstract and technical or just boring, right? But I actually think that all of us in this room already intuitively understand, right, what the shape of this US-China codependence that has been forged over several decades. So to begin with, right, I'm sure everyone is probably aware, right, that many US consumer goods are designed by US companies but manufactured in China. And this is famously as a label that has been put on iPhones for many years, although I tried my own iPhone 6, it wasn't written on there. But if any of you in the room pull out your own iPhone, you might see this small print on your own device. But this is true of actually a lot of consumer goods. This is a little bit more personal. During the pandemic, my wife, she bought a standing desk, creating a home office at home, and whatever, standing desk, no comment. But I noticed in the hallway, right, after she had unpacked and put the desk together, on the box was this label on the left, right, designed in Portland, Oregon, thoughtfully manufactured in Ningbo, China. So this is actually not just an iPhone thing; it's basically on probably everything, well, any fancy things that, especially in the U.S. And so from this kind of small print, I think we can stake out two major premises, right? The first is these kinds of labels reflect the sort of overwhelming dependence of US companies and consumers on Chinese manufacturing, for everything from shoes and clothing, desks and smartphones, to N95 masks and lithium batteries, right, as the pandemic laid bare. As a result, 3 years ago, many experts and politicians began to demand that the US decouple from China and reshore production back home. But notably, public figures have already begun to walk this back. Just a few weeks ago, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan declared that the US's goal with China was no longer decoupling, but instead de-risking and diversifying, right, whatever that means. So this idea of an irreversible entanglement between these two economies, these two societies, that's a theme that I'm going to return to throughout this talk. Secondly, I think those labels on the iPhones and the standing desks, right, they help us crystallize for us the contrast at the heart of the recent history of US and China's political economy, right? Where the US takes a lot of pride in research and design and innovation, right, cutting edge laboratories and so on, China has concentrated much of its effort on perfecting systems of mass production. Since the 1970s, US industries willingly allowed the global marketplace to dictate where to allocate resources and energies. And this often meant moving production overseas to the Americas, but especially to Asia, where labor costs were a fraction of those at home. Now, Chinese officials did dabble in this market logic to a certain degree, but ultimately they refused to surrender control over industry to the marketplace. Industry has thus become a major source of China's economic strength, but also the source of the new tensions with the US. Now, of course, there are actually many overall problems that have been documented, by many social scientists and journalists with this current arrangement of cheap Chinese goods alongside US deindustrialization. And this phenomena has coincided with an era of global stagnation and inequality, right? So it should be acknowledged that this current anger at the rise of China is not entirely misplaced, right? But I also think that China, the country, and sometimes even the Chinese people, have become a scapegoat for decisions that have been made by political and economic elites from all across the world, including, or even especially, right, in the US. So if our current arrangement needs to be reimagined, it seems clear to me that China's capacity as the world's leading industrial power will play a major part, as will some version of our globally integrated supply chains and workforces. In other words, no matter your view on the Chinese government, I think it makes a lot of sense to advocate for greater openness rather than unilateral posturing by one military power against another. In particular, below I'm going to outline how openness between China and the US will be critical in 3 areas moving forward. The 3 I've decided to discuss, although there's probably many others. The 3 include economic growth and innovation, addressing the climate crisis, and global inequality. But before we get there, right, first a kind of a brief detour or sort of rethinking revisionist history, thinking about the last 4 decades of China's political economy to hopefully resituate the present. And this moment that I want to focus on is basically from the 1980s onwards. And this is a moment of history that often gets tossed around by observers and politicians and journalists. But I think it's actually not, it's a period that's not actually very well understood, especially not in this part of the world or any part of the world that's outside of China. And I think a better understanding of China's own political economic trajectory with its pivotal twists and turns can illuminate the current US-China rivalry in a new light. So let's start here. In recent months, commentators and major outlets repeatedly argued that the consolidation of power by Xi Jinping in late 2022 represented an end of an era in Chinese history. So to take one example, to kind of drill down on one example from the Wall Street Journal, this article written from 2 months ago argued that Xi Jinping's rule marks a definitive end to Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening era. This phrase, reform and opening, 改革开放, refers to a political transformation that started, quote, 4 decades ago when Deng, a short stocky survivor of the Cultural Revolution, I don't know why they always include that in there, kicked off an effort to unshackle China from the ideological turmoil of Mao Zedong's rule, embracing capitalist forces and opening China to the West. This meant the decollectivization of its communal agricultural system and inviting foreign investment to create an export-driven economy. Ultimately, the author concludes, Deng's reforms transformed China from a poor, closed nation into an economic superpower and a stable driver of global growth, end quote. And this is the author kind of bemoaning the fact that this moment is over with Xi Jinping. And this article, I think, represents a very common popular understanding of modern Chinese history, which goes something like this, right? We have this first period under the rule of Mao Zedong, from the 50s to the 70s, when the party's planned system squeezed the life out of the Chinese people and their private initiative. This was reversed in the middle by Deng Xiaoping and his proteges, who replaced state rule with a faith in the free market on the one hand, and on the other, they replaced isolationism with an embrace of Western values. This is the alleged story, right? But then this too has been reversed by the authoritarianism of Xi Jinping, the man to blame for recent hostilities. Now, certainly, I don't want to deny a lot of things have changed in the last decade, the last several decades, as indicated above. But I think in order to understand these changes, we should look beyond these kind of seductive stories of individual leaders and their personalities and their psychologies. We should instead pay attention or push forward and drill down on the complex dynamics of the Chinese state, which is by no means as monolithic or harmonious as it is often portrayed. So rather than these breaks and discontinuities in Chinese history, I actually want to highlight a specific kind of continuity that can be found across these different eras. Namely this, that Chinese leaders have consistently emphasized the development of industry and manufacturing capacity, dating back to the Mao period. And they have been unwilling to fully expose those industries to the marketplace, even during the period of reform and opening. So briefly, let me give a sort of quick recount of this 70 years of history. So very briefly, the Mao period. New research has indicated that from the 50s to the 70s, there was actually much more flexibility and, quote, ideological promiscuity between socialism and the market than once assumed. So for instance, historian Jason Kelly, from which these images are taken, he's shown that the Chinese state actually pursued lots of trade deals with so-called capitalist countries in Western Europe and the United States and Canada, North America, let's say, in spite of the trade embargo placed by the US during the Cold War. So they tried to import, valuable goods like machinery and metals and equipment. In exchange, they would send out things like Chinese silks, handicrafts, agricultural goods. So the things they're trying to market to the rest of the world, and these are an actual catalog from 1957, 1958, are things like sort of labor-intensive products like shirts from Shanghai or canned fish, which I think this is probably from Guangdong. It's a big kind of famous canned fish dish in southern China. So these are sort of low-value goods in exchange for high-value goods. So part of a greater developmental scheme. And in fact, many of the key initiatives of the 80s, including these export processing zones and rural factories, they owe their origins to the 50s and the 60s. Okay, so very briefly on that moment, but jumping forward to the 1980s, right? By the time of the 1980s, the idea that some sort of broader change, some broader change was necessary, acquired a sort of universal consensus, not just by Deng Xiaoping, but across the country. The goal was not simply to swap out Eastern socialism for Western capitalism. Instead, once again, state officials sought to instrumentally use the market as a tool for national development, but without surrendering control over the economy. And a new study by economist Isabella Weber illustrates this point. So, as Isabella Weber points out, it was during the 1980s when Chinese officials openly invited economists from Europe and the US, as well as World Bank officials, to recommend to them economic reforms. How do you fix socialism, basically, in line with the lessons of capitalism? This group represented, in hindsight, an intellectual movement that we know today as the neoliberals, right? Economic thinkers who openly criticized inefficient planning in capitalist countries and socialist countries, and they championed market forces as the best mechanisms for organizing society. So in the US, for instance, neoliberalism is often associated with the deregulation of banks, crushing of unions, the end of welfare, and so on. Now in China, these neoliberals, they encouraged officials to scrap the socialist economy overnight, right? They call this package reform, so not gradual reform, but a package reform. And later in the USSR, this kind of recommendation took on the name of a Big Bang or shock therapy, where they just undid the socialist economy overnight. In the USSR, this had disastrous results. Unlike the USSR and unlike much of the rest of the world, Chinese officials ultimately resisted this neoliberal impulse, at least not entirely, right? So what Weber talks about is that there was a coalition of older and younger voices who challenged this ideology of unfettered market forces. They convinced Premier, the kind of lead economic decision maker at the time, Zhao Ziyang on the left, who was meeting with Milton Friedman, sort of the incarnation of neoliberalism in person. So they convinced Zhao Ziyang to avoid shock therapy and to kind of hold on to parts of the economy. According to Weber, this was probably because these reformers who pushed back, right? These reformers approached economic questions in China from the standpoint of the countryside, of agriculture and rural China. They were not only concerned with these abstract questions of price and efficiency, but also concrete questions like the material constraints of China's infrastructure, which was built for a socialist economy, not for a global capitalist economy. So for instance, one reformer explained to Weber in an interview that he knew, yes, market forces could work. They would benefit allocating consumer goods like watches and bicycles and televisions. But there were also many essential goods that were too important to be surrendered to the market. In China's case in particular, industrial materials like timber, cement, charcoal, coal, chemicals, steel, and fertilizer. Unchecked market demand for these goods would overwhelm China's infrastructure, which was not prepared for it, and this runaway inflation would therefore paralyze society. So this is what they wanted to avoid. So in the end, in the 1980s, these reformers did liberalize non-essential goods at the margins of the economy, but they retained the socialist industrial core, which they then sought to upgrade through state government measures. Now, notably, although Chinese reformers were willing to embrace some aspects of so-called Western capitalism, they were also well aware of the crisis of Western capitalism in the 1980s, ever since, or punctuated by the 1973 oil crisis. So this is a time when the United States economy was actually struggling, so it actually didn't make a lot of sense for China to look up to the United States and Western Europe's economic performance. Beyond the West, in fact, much of their inspiration actually came from their own backyard, which is to say East Asia. Japan and the Four Tigers of Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore, all of which had gone from poor to rich within 1 or 2 generations in the 20th century. So here are the words of Premier Zhao Ziyang, kind of announcing a strategy to develop the coasts of China. He says, he gives like a very, what's the word? Not comprehensive, but very useful, but what's the word? Kind of hovering over summarial history of world history of capitalism in the Pacific Ocean. He says, in the development of the world economy, labor-intensive industries like clothing, toys, plastics, kind of manually produced goods, they generally migrate to places with lower labor costs. From the perspective of the Asia-Pacific region, early on they migrated from the US to Japan, so roughly the 50s onwards. After they migrated to Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore, 60s and 70s. So right now in the 80s, we are facing a new migration. Where will they turn to? Of course, they will move to places with the cheap labor costs, China, right? And so he makes it very clear here that he views this developmental project in China as part of a lineage of industrialization in East Asia, right? Not just copying and pasting the United States or Western Europe. And so, for instance, in southern China, Chinese officials would open up coastal regions in southern China and eastern China to produce cheaper, labor-intensive consumer goods for the world market, clothing, shoes, toys, electronics. But notably, this was not just an abstract East Asian model or East Asian pattern. Almost all the investment, in fact, concretely came from East Asian capital. Compatriots or ethnic Chinese entrepreneurs living in Hong Kong or Taiwan or overseas, as much as 70% of foreign direct investment into China to the late 90s came from ethnic Chinese business partners. Chinese officials, however, they wanted to make sure that they did not get stuck at this lower stage of development, endlessly making clothes for the rest of the world and not developing beyond that. So they formed plans to accumulate capital, skills, and technologies to eventually make valuable goods that would allow them to become a global industrial powerhouse, following the footsteps of Japan and East Asia before them. And so seen in this light, right, rethinking the 80s strategy should place the 90s and the 2000s in a different light. The late 90s and early 2000s represent then a kind of a brief window in China's history, when officials did come close to embracing a neoliberal vision of unleashed market forces, and when foreign observers felt optimistic that China would eventually become more like a Western, capitalist, perhaps even democratic society, right? And the anchoring event here is in 2001, when China joins the World Trade Organization, a world body that facilitates trade and investment among its members, led by Euro-America. And the main negotiations took place in 1999 between Bill Clinton on the right and the Premier Zhu Rongji from China that summer into spring. And the ultimate measure where China would join the WTO doesn't take place for 2 more years in 2001, after they kind of hash out all these agreements with the rest of the members in Europe. As one US official put it, WTO entry was aimed to ensure, quote, China's reemergence would be constructive, not destructive, to the global system of order. So China can join the rest of the world. China's bid to join this world order, however, was not nearly as unanimous as foreign observers believed. and ultimately it was short-lived, according to Yeling Tan. In China, the pro-WTO side was led by the central Beijing government. In the lead up to the agreement, they agreed to do things such as open up the domestic market to foreign investors, float prices for goods, enforce intellectual property laws, and make it easier for companies to hire and fire workers in line with the rest of the world. But many local leaders in the provinces, the counties, and the cities of China were never on board with a lot of these policies. They feared foreign competition, and whenever possible, they used interventionist measures to bolster their local industries. So for instance, in the provinces of Anhui and Shandong, they implemented policies to protect their automobile and shipbuilding sectors. And this has been successful. Chery Automobile is a transnational automobile company that stems from the rural province of Anhui. And this entailed strategies such as consolidating small firms and kind of taking unprofitable firms out of business and setting hard production targets for these large consolidated firms, all in order to ward off international competition. And all of this technically broke the rules of the WTO. Local authorities also attacked the WTO and their external rules on the grounds of nationalism, right? They accused the leaders in Beijing for selling out the country and betraying the nation by agreeing to all these external rules. The breaking point seems to have occurred around 2006. It was in 2006 when the CCP issues a new 5-year plan that placed special emphasis on indigenous innovation, right? The use of innovation in these documents kind of skyrockets from then. They also talk about supporting industries that are designated as pillar, backbone, lifeline, strategic industries, right? They're just too important to be left to the marketplace, and they need government support. Meantime, foreign observers, US observers based in China, they began to complain amongst themselves and in the WTO that China was violating the rules of the free market. And so this is a chart it's a survey among the US Chamber of Commerce asking people, what do you think about the business climate? In China, you can see there's a brief spike in 2006 and kind of gradual spike after that of a sense that is actually not a good business climate in China. Overall, it's still quite positive, but there seems to be a kind of a beginning of a turning point in the middle of the 2000s. And remember, compare this to the charts from the beginning of the talk where I indicated from the US perspective, if you survey people in the US or around the world, the turning point seems to be around 11 or 12 or 13. My hypothesis then is that on the ground, the real turning point in China was around 2006, and there's sort of this lag that takes place for 4 or 5 years after this. For many outsiders, these industrial policies in China appeared almost out of left field. For instance, the US company AT&T was one of the main US companies that lobbied in the 1990s for China's entry into the WTO on promises that they would gain access to the Chinese market. But once China joined the WTO, in fact, the Chinese government proceeded to consolidate a lot of the local telecom industries into one large national one, China Telecom, and therefore squeezed out AT&T. AT&T really has no presence in China. And this is out of left field, right? They were kind of promised things in the 90s. From a broader perspective, though, all this also kind of represented a shift backwards to this East Asia-inspired industrial policy of the 1980s, which was aimed at upgrading China's place in the global value chain. It also reflected, again, as Isabella Weber points out, that Chinese officials have consistently distinguished between non-essential consumer goods, which can be left to the market, versus essential industries that the state refuses to surrender. Now, this transition back to a state-led industrial policy was also punctuated by the 2008 financial crisis, which had deep effects in China as well. As with the US, the Chinese state rushed out a bailout package in China worth about 4 trillion RMB or 600 billion US dollars. And importantly, that money was distributed, not just kind of thrown into the market, but it was distributed through state-owned banks to local governments and state-owned enterprises. So the impact, the kind of relative share of the China's economy goes up as a result of the 2008 crisis. Over the next 4 years, assets owned by state firms doubled from 12 to 25 trillion RMB. And this was paired with greater limits on foreign investment from outside, government crackdowns on so-called corrupt or speculative market activity. This is kind of Xi Jinping's calling card, but especially after 2015 when there was another kind of miniature financial crisis within China. And again, the sociologist Ho Fengheng summarizes what has happened ever since. He says, the US and China remained harmonious as long as China was weak and content with being US's junior partner. Once China reached a certain level of capacity and confidence, however, it began to show greater ambition, and the US started to see it as a challenger. Harmony then gave way to conflict. So what are some of the key takeaways to this kind of revisionist whirlwind account of Chinese history? The first thing I want to kind of point out is, look at the dates. We're talking about transformations that are happening in 2006 or 2008. These are years before the ascension of Xi Jinping, right? So these are deeper structural transformations. And Xi Jinping, in a lot of ways, you could say, if you want to be sympathetic to him, which if you want to, you could say that he has actually been responding to crises or contradictions within the system that predate when it comes to power in the first place. This also means that any sort of reform era in China that embraced the US-led order, as implied by the Wall Street Journal article, that's a serious exaggeration. If anything, it lasted for maybe a decade, right? And to me, if we are entering a new era of history, it is not because Chinese leaders broke earlier promises about embracing the West. They broke the promise to AT&T. This idea, that notion that China would become like the West, that was, in a lot of ways, was based on wishful thinking by the cheerleaders of globalization in the 1990s, figures such as Bill Clinton and Thomas Friedman and so on, right? Kind of projecting what they wanted to see happen rather than what China said they would do. Instead, then, we can think of the last decade as a sort of reassertion of Chinese officials' longstanding insistence upon industry as a cornerstone of development and moving up this value chain as inspired by East Asia. Indeed, the contradictions within the US-China relationship were kind of there all along. And in recent years, they've reached a logical breaking point. This has left everyone in the world, including US and Chinese elites, scrambling. And to me, then, this is kind of a better way to frame the transition or the sort of the end of the one era and the beginning of a new era. And so this is kind of where things stand today. According to technology analyst Dan Wang, China, again, has forged a competitive advantage by creating the world's best, quote, manufacturing ecosystem. Rather than breakthroughs in science, Chinese companies mastered how to scale up and make things more effectively and efficiently, relying upon a skilled labor pool, quote, dense clusters of suppliers, and extensive government support, end quote. By contrast, right, US companies, as I mentioned before, they decided to focus on research, development, and design at the highest level. And on the other hand, they focus on service jobs and finance. But they readily moved a lot of manufacture overseas in order to chase cheaper labor and tax breaks while gutting organized labor back home. Since 1978, US manufacturing jobs have fallen from 19 to 12.5 million. And if we control for population growth, that basically means it's fallen by over 1/2 in relative terms. I'll talk about this a little bit more below, but again, the US and China are now in a sort of codependent relationship, commercially, industrially, financially. And this relationship is impossible to disentangle anytime soon without damaging both superpowers and, by extension, the global economy. So now let me turn from this kind of brief history lesson to the present. In the present US-China rivalry, where I'll try to talk about 3 areas that are discussed a lot, where I believe it is crucial for the two to retain sort of at least open lines of communication. Maybe cooperation is too big of an ask, even as they pursue their own respective strategies going forward. And the first one is this question of growth and innovation, kind of broadly defined. Now again, the pandemic taught us that countless high-tech goods rely upon complex supply chains spanning multiple continents. And you can barely see this, but there is a sort of watermark here. You can see the countries underneath it. So this is a map of the world and where all these kind of parts for semiconductors are put together from. So we can take this well-publicized case of semiconductors or silicon chips, which the US prioritized recently in the CHIPS Act, aimed at rejuvenating manufacturing at home. Now, semiconductors, many of you probably know better than me, are small chips made of silicon that serve as the foundation for countless electronic devices. They were invented, of course, in Silicon Valley, California, led by Intel in the 1960s. But since then, these chips have become incredibly valuable in an increasingly digitized world. Today, their production relies upon a globalized supply chain of cutting-edge hardware, software, and fabrication facilities, known as fabs, located across critical clusters in the US, East Asia, and Northern Europe. In the past few decades, in their sort of moving up the value chain, Chinese companies actually spent more money importing semiconductors for their electronics than they spent on oil, right? So it is actually the most valuable import into China. Realizing their foreign dependence, the Chinese government created something known as the Big Fund in 2014, about 340 billion RMB big, or $50 billion US, to invest into new and old companies to lead China's indigenous production of these silicon chips. There were many stories of fraud and corruption and just kind of shell companies, right? But there was also the big success story of Huawei. which is today a global leader in phones, chips, and 5G infrastructure. US officials around the same time began to grow nervous about China's chip industry in 2015, according to historian Chris Miller, quote, "For a generation, America's elite had welcomed and enabled China's economic rise, but competition with China was now seen primarily in zero-sum terms." It was around the same time, again 2015, that China announced its Made in China campaign. The goal was to transform China, quote, "from a manufacturing giant to a world manufacturing power by 2049. Special emphasis was placed on semiconductors, robotics, electric vehicles, and infrastructure." The Made in China campaign immediately was attacked by foreign observers, especially from the US, as, quote, "breaking the rules of the free market." So Chinese officials just simply stopped using the phrase in public. It actually disappeared from government documents ever since then. But as a recent report indicates, these large government subsidies for industry continue to be handed out, especially to electric vehicles and semiconductors. And so Made in China is actually alive and well. They just don't use the word or the phrase. In response, last year, the US placed a series of export controls on China's chip industry. And these have already begun to have a serious impact. Huawei has already begun to retool its whole strategy for smartphones and 5G due to these shortages of chips. But the chip industry as a whole is scattered across the globe. If China cannot indigenize its chip industry entirely, then neither can the US, nor anyone else. One US executive told the White House, quote, "Our fundamental problem is that our number one customer is our number one competitor." Right? So decoupling would be disastrously inefficient. Each country would basically spend hundreds of billions of dollars to create poor facsimiles of the facilities that already exist elsewhere around the world, and by the time they actually get them up and running, they'll probably be 5 years behind. Right? It's an industry that kind of develops every single year. Morris Chang, the founder of Taiwan Semiconductor, which is the world's leading fabrication plant, warned that the greater protectionism would lead to, quote, would mean costs will go up, technology development will slow down. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong, of course, with the US investing into its own industry. But to proceed by cutting itself off from China with the express aim of kneecapping China, this would not only raise hostilities, it would also be self-defeating in terms of growth and innovation. And this applies to many other industrial sectors, but perhaps most importantly, renewable clean energy technologies. Now, it's very possible some of you in this room do not care about profits and innovation in semiconductor chips, and it's fair enough. I'm not sure we all have to anyway. But the importance of clean energy is a much easier sell, right? Because it's actually getting at problems that are existential, supranational, right? Universal. Now, as a newly industrializing society, China is the number one energy consumer in the world and the emitter of greenhouse gases, especially through coal. But in the last decade, it has also turned itself into the world's leader in renewable technologies and infrastructure manufacture. And once again, in this case, China was not the innovator, but it became a world leader due to its industrial policy, following many of those same plot points I was laying out, right? So this shows how their wind and solar capacity in particular lead the world and are multiple times larger than others. China's renewable industries were first created by that same 2006 5-year plan, emphasizing indigenous innovation. And for solar, in particular, according to energy expert Joanna Lewis, the turning point were those massive subsidies that were handed out after the 2008 crisis. Right? So this is actually built into the same history I've been telling. Today, China's wind and solar capacity leads the world, about 2 to 3 times that of the US, but ahead of the US where much of the original R&D actually took place. China also accounts for 3/4 of the world's capacity for lithium batteries used in electronic vehicles and 2/3 for solar panels. And this stuff is just always in the news. This is from 2 days ago. The New York Times ran a whole story basically saying that the US can't make electric vehicles or lithium batteries without China, right? So kind of blurring a warning sign. For these reasons, a recent article in Science declared, quote, "The decoupling cure is likely to be worse than the integration disease." That same article concludes that some degree of healthy competition between the US and China is natural and potentially beneficial for this transition to a post-carbon world. But the fear, of course, is that if the clean energy race is framed as a zero-sum geopolitical rivalry, then the US and China could force others to choose partners based upon political calculations. This would drive up the prices for these technologies and probably disincentivize adaptation. Now, both countries insist that they can kind of compartmentalize, right, and keep climate policies away from geopolitics. But over time, we've seen the walls are actually quite porous. Last August, after Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, Chinese officials canceled high-level climate talks with the US. And again, this stuff is always in the news. A friend of mine just sent this article, which was published this morning, kind of warning about the very same thing, the very thing that the literature worries about, that the US-China geopolitical battle will begin to impact the ability of the world to transition to clean energy. So, and beyond these two countries in particular, the urgent question is really making clean energy affordable for the developing world, the rest of the world, where currently China is by far the top exporter, again, of renewable technologies and infrastructure. In the words of Joanna Lewis, there is, quote, enormous untapped potential for China to transfer its own decarbonization model to other developing countries. So for the sake of the planet, for the sake of everyone, right, we should hope that these US-China rivalries do not get in the way, although the signs are not that optimistic. And third, finally, the last thing I want to talk about, and kind of going over some of the territory that I've already discussed, are the social consequences of the US-China rivalry. So the US-China trading relationship since the 80s and since the 90s has made a lot of people rich, but it has also coincided with rising inequality in both countries. China's entry into the WTO alone directly led to the loss of nearly 2 million manufacturing jobs in the US, what some economists call the China shock. But to fully unpack globalization's winners and losers, we actually have to take a broader view. Most wages in the US have actually declined for much longer, since the 70s. Americans have been able to survive mostly because consumer goods are also cheaper than ever before, imported from overseas, most recently China. But beyond this, most Americans also rely upon consumer credit to survive in lieu of savings, right? Credit cards, mortgages, student loans, and so on. So consumer debt in the US continues to grow larger every year, and China here plays a role as well. This is explained by Michael Pettis, a Beijing-based professor of finance. Since the 2000s, because of this export surplus that these Chinese companies have racked up, Chinese banks have accumulated a massive trade surplus in US dollars. Normally, what this means is that wages and prices in China would go up, right? And this would also make Chinese goods more expensive. But the Chinese government's fixation on economic growth and keeping this export machine growing prevented them from allowing this to happen. So they have multiple strategies where they make sure that the wages of Chinese workers and of Chinese households is actually much lower. It's repressed relative to overall economic growth in China. So the dotted line is GDP, like just national profits. But in terms of how much money the average household has, it's much lower. The two strategies that are most notable is first, since '94, China has devalued its currency, which keeps goods cheap, but also undercuts Chinese citizens' own purchasing power. Second, they have also regulated an internal migrant labor force that lives in big cities and works in the factories, but they are severely underpaid and are denied bargaining power and social benefits. Chinese banks have also taken these US dollars out of circulation in China and reinvested them overseas elsewhere. One major strategy that has attracted a lot of attention is the strategy of purchasing US Treasury bonds, right? Which is to say, in effect, this means that, and this is kind of complicated, but it makes sense. It's a kind of big cyclical process. Chinese banks are lending US dollars back to US banks. This keeps interest rates low in the US, where the banks lend the money out to US consumers. They reissue that credit back to US consumers, who then use the money to buy even more Chinese goods, leading to profits for Chinese companies, which goes into the Chinese banks and keeping the whole cycle alive. In other words, much of global trade, the kind of burgeoning global trade between the US and China and the rest of the world, is not necessarily a reflection of bounty, but in fact is a giant lending scheme layered on top of stagnant wages. And it should be pointed out, this is true of a lot of countries, but in particular, the US and China, the US leads the world by far in debt, and China leads the world by far in surplus. And so the US and China are kind of the two poles of this global arrangement. And so it should be pointed out, even as we look at this chart where the US and China seem to be on diametric opposite poles, at the same time, in both Chinese and US societies, we've seen parallel processes of inequality, weakened labor, and predation upon migrant workforces. Internal migration, external migration, and so on. So this perspective should undermine any sort of one-sided demonization of Chinese workers as the enemy of the US working class, as nationalist politicians will often claim. And in fact, inequality across the entire world is at historic highs, and this has squeezed the life out of the world economy, according to Michael Pettis. Yes, companies are making lots of goods, more goods than ever before, but very few people actually have the money to buy those goods. This explains why much of the US-China rivalry is actually framed often as a zero-sum game, as that quote above indicated. The economic pie seems to be shrinking rather than growing, and therefore any encroachments by one power against another can be easily perceived as an existential threat, throwing off a delicate balance. This also points to why reversing trends of inequality in the US and China and the rest of the world cannot be a unilateral process, right, but one of open communication. For instance, if the US were to eventually cut off imports from China, as Trump threatened to do, this would still not address the lack of manufacturing in the US and the meager savings of most Americans. US consumers would suffer by having to buy more expensive goods with less credit, and falling demand would hurt Chinese companies, which would produce mass unemployment in China. Thus, according to Pettis, if the US retreats from its traditional role as source of global demand without agreeing to a new set of rules with the rest of the world, global trade will become unstable and increasingly contentious. Pettis draws an analogy with 100 years ago at the turn of the 20th century, when inequality had similarly squeezed the life out of a world economy that grew vulnerable to nationalist rivalries and eventually horrific military consequences. So if the US and China are to transform their unhealthy codependency, then they needed to do so together. It's very therapy adjacent talk. Optimistically, there are already a lot of signs that individually, both countries have recognized the need to move on from the economic models of the past few decades. In the US, the surprising success of the Trump and Sanders campaigns, for instance, have pushed the critique of free market ideology from the margins to the mainstream. And so the Biden administration, for instance, has pushed for massive spending to rejuvenate manufacturing, labor, and middle-class jobs. Here he is speaking at the, I believe, the first real semiconductor plant that will be run along with Taiwan Semiconductor in Phoenix, Arizona. We'll see how it goes. It's still under construction. Similarly, in China, Chinese officials have recognized the need to rebalance its economy since at least 2007. They recognize the need to more equitably distribute wealth and boost domestic consumption, even if it comes at the expense of overseas profits and GDP targets. And this is from their 14th five-year plan from 2021, known as the 145. And they come up with this slogan called dual circulation. It could also be called dual cycles, where they're talking about the cycle of export-driven growth alongside the cycle of increasing domestic growth, domestic consumption at home. So this is them addressing the need to rebalance the domestic economy. And finally, and here obviously for time constraints, I can only touch on this a little bit, it also would probably mean that surpluses of capital bound up in the richest countries of the world should be made available to the rest of the world too. The controversial Belt and Road Initiative, which is led by Chinese banks and the Chinese government, is ripe for lots of criticism. But it does at least represent a genuine commitment, nearly $70 billion worth, to build infrastructure and manufacturing in societies across the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Central Europe. This is as of 2 years ago, the sort of infrastructure projects associated with the Belt and Road. This explains, again, why poor countries, democratic ones, authoritarian ones, think more highly of China than the US, as indicated by that Pew survey above. Again, from Jake Warner, he says, instead of demonizing the BRI, US leaders should recognize the reasons it has found such an enthusiastic reception around the world. The billions living in the global south have been starved of capital for decades, as the inequalities of free market globalization concentrated investment in the richest countries. Okay, so to kind of bring things to the beginning, kind of wrap things up. Today, we do seem to be entering a new historical era, one in which Chinese and US elites recognize the need to move on from a model of race to the bottom globalization, although this is all in theory. We'll see about whether it happens in practice. Now, this transition is not about Chinese leaders breaking their promises to be like the West, right? That was never the case. In fact, China's earlier repudiation of free market ideology and its insistence upon industrial policy now appear increasingly prescient in the US and in other countries. Instead, this is really about a dynamics that are global in character, but in which China and the US have wound up playing leading roles. The fear, however, is that we don't really have anything to replace our current model with anything better than Cold War-style nationalistic posturing. So we need to be wary of zero-sum framings of this US-China relationship to emphasize the necessity of openness and cooperation and the material foundations for which have already been cast in these networks of interdependence around the world. So problems, again, such as growth, innovation and wages, the climate crisis, and inequality, both within and across societies. These are global problems that require at least bilateral, but even better, global solutions. Obviously, we can only control what we can control. Like, none of us in here have access to the levers of power in DC or Beijing. But as a modest start, I think it would be useful to begin reframing our everyday understanding and conversations away from the current climate of demonization and towards a recognition of problems shared in common. Okay, so thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.